There are moments in life when the world narrows to the width of a single hallway, the length of a single breath, the scrape of cardboard against linoleum as you pack the remnants of your past into a box you never wanted to fill. For Rebecca Hayes, that moment arrived on a gray October morning as she stood in her small apartment, the final eviction notice trembling in her hand. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dirty window, illuminating dust motes that danced above piles of old books, lesson plans, and a faded wedding photograph. Artifacts of a life that had come apart, quietly at first, then all at once. The silence in the apartment pressed against her ears, broken only by the click of the clock on the wall and the distant traffic of a city already moving on. She was a former schoolteacher, a daughter, a mother, and now, by the grace of chance, a woman with nowhere left to go. The teaching job she'd loved was gone, lost in a wave of budget cuts and layoffs that swept through the district like a cold front. Her marriage had collapsed, drawn out over 2 bitter years until the final signatures on the divorce papers arrived, as impersonal as junk mail. Now, the last of her savings had trickled away, leaving her with a battered old pickup, a handful of keepsakes, and a single thin envelope. The letter was the only thing in her hands as she walked through the empty rooms for the last time. It bore her mother's handwriting, a script she hadn't seen in years, though it was the attorney's firm block letters on the envelope that mattered now. Rebecca read it again and again, her eyes lingering on the words, "You have inherited the family ranch and a Mustang named Dusty." It sounded like a joke. Her mother's ranch was a place from another lifetime, a faded photograph in her mind's eye. Wind-bent grass, rusting fences, the sharp tang of hay, and horse sweat in the air. She remembered her mother chasing wild Mustangs across the plains, but Rebecca herself had never belonged to that world. She was a city woman now, or so she thought. The morning of her departure arrived cold and cloudless. She crammed what little she owned into the back of her truck: 2 battered suitcases, a photo album, a half-empty box of lesson plans, her mother's old cast-iron skillet, and a shoebox filled with letters and mementos. Her hand hesitated over the wedding photo, its edges curling, the faces inside still smiling as if nothing had changed. With a sigh, she slipped it between her books and shut the box. She didn't need reminders. Every step outside her door was a reminder. Rebecca glanced around the apartment one last time, letting her gaze linger on the place where her children's drawings once covered the refrigerator, on the faded blue rug where she and her ex-husband danced one New Year's Eve before the children were born. The air inside felt thin, pressed flat by years of routine and heartache. When she stepped into the hall, the door closed behind her with a hollow finality that echoed down to her bones. The drive out of the city was an act of faith, a journey into a kind of silence she had not known in decades. As the skyline gave way to open plains, the world spread out before her: golden fields, low hills, the sky impossibly wide and blue. She passed forgotten towns and lonely service stations, her hands gripping the wheel as if it were the only solid thing in her life. The radio played old country songs, voices threading through memories of childhood rides with her mother, their laughter echoing across the fields. She pressed the gas and tried to ignore the ache in her chest. By late afternoon, the land had swallowed the last traces of the city. Fences leaned at strange angles, cattle dotted distant pastures, and the wind picked up in long, mournful sighs. The road to her mother's ranch was little more than a rutted track now, 2 pale lines stretching toward the horizon. Rebecca slowed the truck and peered through the dusty windshield, heart pounding as she recognized the faded wooden sign, Hayes Ranch. The letters were chipped and weathered, but they were hers now. Hers and no one else's. She drove past a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the wind, and the house appeared at last, crouched low against the rising land. It looked smaller than she remembered, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust and time. The barn sagged under its own weight, and the paddock was overgrown with weeds. For a moment, the urge to turn around nearly overwhelmed her. But she pressed on, stopping the truck beside the porch. Rebecca stepped out, her boots crunching in gravel and dried grass. She listened, really listened, to the sounds of the ranch. The sighing wind, the distant call of a hawk, the nervous snort of an animal nearby, and there, at the far end of the paddock, a shape moved, golden and wild. The Mustang, Dusty, her mother's horse. He lifted his head and stared at her, nostrils flaring, mane tangled and unkempt. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance, strangers and kin at once. The sun slipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard. Rebecca dragged her belongings inside, her breath clouding in the cold, and sat on the edge of an old cot in the tack room. The walls pressed close, lined with the ghosts of old saddles and the faint scent of leather. She unpacked a single blanket, pulled it around her shoulders, and tried not to shiver, tried not to think about all she had lost. But as darkness settled and the wind rattled the loose boards, something else crept in. The fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this place could become a beginning, rather than an end. The dawn came reluctantly, filtered through a patchwork of gray clouds and the grime-smeared window panes of the old tack room. Rebecca woke on the thin cot, her body stiff from the cold and her mind thick with uncertainty. For a few seconds, she let herself pretend she was still in her apartment, still a teacher, still someone with a plan. But the unfamiliar ache in her back and the musty scent of straw banished any such illusions. She was home now, though the word felt strange on her tongue. She gathered her blanket and stood, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of ranch sounds, the insistent clucking of birds in the rafters, the groan of aging wood, and somewhere outside, the restless movement of a large animal. Her breath fogged in the chill air as she made her way outside, boots crunching on frozen ground. The ranch unfurled before her, haunted by absence and neglect. The main house, once white and proud, now wore a shroud of peeling paint and encroaching weeds. Shingles dangled from the roof, threatening to give way at the next strong gust. The windows were clouded with years of dust, as if the house itself were squinting at her, uncertain if she belonged. Rebecca stepped up onto the porch, the boards creaking dangerously beneath her weight, and pressed her hand against the doorframe. The wood felt cold and unfamiliar, splinters biting into her palm, a warning and a welcome all at once. Pushing open the door, she entered a space preserved in melancholy. The kitchen smelled of mouse droppings and stale memories. Cabinets hung open, their contents scattered and broken. A faded calendar hung by the stove, forever marking a day years gone. The living room sagged under its own sadness. Sagging armchairs, a broken lamp, dust thick enough to write her name in. Her footsteps disturbed the stillness, stirring up motes of memory. On the mantel, an old photograph of her mother astride a chestnut horse stared back, both proud and defiant. Rebecca brushed her fingers across the frame, tracing the outlines of a past she had tried to outrun. Outside, the world seemed even larger, the sky impossibly wide, She stepped into the yard, surveying the overgrown paddock and collapsed fence lines. The barn, its red paint faded to a memory, leaned wearily against the horizon. Somewhere inside, her inheritance waited, a living link to a woman she barely understood. Rebecca crossed the tangled grass, her boots catching on hidden debris, and peered through the splintered boards of the paddock. There Dusty roamed, a Mustang with a wild mane and wary eyes. He moved with a restless energy, circling the broken fence as if testing its strength. When he caught sight of her, he froze, ears pricked and nostrils flaring. They regarded each other in the cool morning air, neither willing to break the fragile peace. She didn't try to approach. Instead, she leaned against the fence and watched, letting the silence speak between them. Dusty was not like the horses she remembered from childhood visits, those docile creatures that nuzzled for treats and stood quietly for a brush. He was something older, shaped by wind and hardship, half wild and wholly beautiful. For a long time, Rebecca stood there, drawing comfort from his steady presence, the rise and fall of his breath. With the day stretching before her, she returned to the barn, pushing open the heavy doors with effort. Inside, shafts of sunlight cut through holes in the roof, illuminating a chaos of broken tools, old tack, and bales of musty hay. She found a battered pitchfork and began the slow work of clearing space, her muscles complaining with every lift. Dust and mouse droppings filled the air, and a faint sense of accomplishment crept in with every armful she dragged away. It was exhausting, unglamorous work, but it was real, each small victory a claim staked against despair. As the sun climbed, she foraged through the farmhouse, searching for anything salvageable. In the pantry, she unearthed a few rusted cans, beans, peaches, and a can of creamed corn that had probably survived 3 presidents. She wiped them down, grateful for any food at all. She found an old kettle, its handle bent but functional, and brought it to the barn, determined to make herself a home, however temporary. By midday, her hands were raw, and her stomach growled. She perched on the barn threshold, eating cold beans from a can and gazing across the ranch. The wind stirred the grass, bending it in rippling waves. She tried to remember the last time she'd felt so exposed, so entirely at the mercy of her surroundings. The city had its dangers, loneliness, indifference, the constant press of bills. But here, every failure would be her own, every bruise and triumph earned. That night, she returned to the tack room, dragging in an extra bale of hay for warmth. She curled beneath her blanket, the ache in her bones matched by a deeper ache in her chest. Shadows danced on the cracked plaster walls, shaped by the flicker of her flashlight. Outside, the Mustang's hooves thudded softly in the paddock, a steady counterpoint to the rise and fall of her breath. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the howling wind and the chorus of creaks from the old barn. Memories crowded in, her mother's laughter, her children's voices, the bitter fights and broken promises that had led her here. Each one was a weight, but also a tether. She was alone, but not entirely lost. Somewhere in the night, Rebecca made a silent promise. She would try to make this place her own. She would fight, however clumsily, for a sense of belonging, if not for herself, then for the memory of the woman who had once believed in her. And outside, under a sky cold and bright with stars, Dusty circled the paddock, untamed and unbroken, waiting for the dawn. The days that followed unfolded like a test, written by a merciless teacher, each new dawn bringing a lesson in humility. Rebecca quickly learned that nostalgia had blinded her to the reality of what it meant to live alone on an abandoned ranch as winter pressed in from the horizon. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of earth and wood smoke. The sky overhead a vast, watchful blue. She woke before the sun, shivering in the tack room, her breath visible in the frigid air. Her body sore from nights spent on hay bales hastily arranged as a mattress. Her routine became a patchwork of survival tasks. She scavenged through the ruins of the farmhouse, prying open stuck drawers and upending closets, searching for anything that could be useful. Most of what she found was ruined. Old linens gnawed by mice, tools rusted and splintered, canned food years past expiration. Still, every usable item felt like a small treasure. She took to wearing layers of mismatched clothes, thick socks under rubber boots, a faded flannel from her mother's closet that still carried the faintest trace of lilac. Every morning, Rebecca gathered firewood, her arms straining as she dragged fallen limbs from the windbreak behind the barn. She stacked the wood neatly near the tack room door, rationing what little dry timber she could find. Lighting a fire became a battle of patience. Sometimes the match would sputter out. Other times the damp kindling would simply smoke and smolder, refusing to catch. But every time a spark finally became a flame, she felt a flicker of pride, a small triumph against the cold, the silence and her own doubts. Food was an even greater challenge. The pantry yielded only so much, and each meal became an exercise in creativity. Rebecca boiled old rice in her mother's dented pot, mixing in whatever canned vegetables she could salvage. She roasted potatoes she unearthed from the overgrown garden, their skins gnarled and tough but edible. Hunger taught her to be grateful for every bite. She ate in silence, sitting on the edge of the tack room cot, listening to the wind rattle the boards and the distant sounds of Dusty's hooves in the paddock. Despite the hardship, the Mustang became her only companion, a living tether to the world beyond her own swirling thoughts. Dusty had a way of appearing wherever she went, sometimes watching her from across the fence, other times trailing behind her at a cautious distance. Rebecca began to talk to him, not expecting answers, but finding comfort in his attentive gaze and the way he seemed to listen. When panic surged up, when the loneliness pressed so hard she could barely breathe, Dusty's steady presence was a balm, grounding her in the here and now. One morning, as a cold wind swept down from the hills, Rebecca found herself curled on the floor, breath coming fast and shallow, the walls closing in. Her thoughts spun in circles. She would never survive the winter. She would never see her children again. She would never be enough. But then a soft muzzle nudged her shoulder. Dusty, poking his head through the tack room door, his breath warm and earthy. Rebecca pressed her forehead to his and let the steady rhythm of his breathing calm her racing heart. In those quiet moments, she remembered how to keep going. Repairs became another endless challenge. The roof of the tack room leaked in 3 places, so she scavenged old tarps from the barn and nailed them up with shaking hands. She stuffed cracks with rags and plastic, praying it would be enough to keep out the worst of the cold. She patched fences, tightening wire with borrowed tools, her fingers raw and bleeding. Each day ended in exhaustion, but also in a sense of stubborn satisfaction. She was still here, and so was the ranch, but the nights remained the hardest. The wind seemed to find every weakness in the old walls, whistling through the gaps and rattling the windows. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sharp crack of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote, or her own anxious dreams. Sometimes she awoke in the darkness, convinced she had heard her mother's voice or the laughter of her children. She would lie still, listening to the silence, letting the ache move through her until it faded. As the days grew shorter and the first hints of frost painted the fields, Rebecca found small moments of hope. She discovered a stash of her mother's preserves, jars of jam and pickled vegetables hidden behind loose boards in the pantry. She set them on the shelf, their colors a reminder that someone before her had survived, had prepared for hard times, had believed in the promise of spring. Dusty, too, became more than just a companion. He began to follow her as she worked, his curiosity drawing him closer. She started to leave handfuls of oats and carrots near the fence, watching as he approached. Wary but tempted by hunger and the slow bloom of trust. Rebecca found herself smiling more, talking aloud as she worked, her voice echoing across the empty yard. Yet survival was never far from her mind. She counted every log, every can, every usable item as winter crept nearer. She did not let herself hope for too much, but each day she managed to keep the fire burning, to find something to eat, and to see Dusty roaming the paddock. She felt just a little less alone. The ranch was battered, and so was she. But beneath the scars, both still held the quiet strength to endure. Days at the ranch became a rhythm of hardship and fleeting victories. Rebecca lost herself in the daily grind, mending fences, hauling firewood, and patching holes wherever cold crept in. Each morning brought a chill that seeped through her bones, and each night a fatigue that pressed down like an extra blanket. The loneliness ebbed and flowed, but the presence of Dusty, always somewhere in her line of sight, offered a silent companionship that kept despair at bay. One morning, the air felt sharper than usual, tinged with the promise of the first true freeze. Rebecca pulled her coat tight and set about her chores with determination. She'd noticed the old barn's hayloft sagged more with each rainstorm, and after a week of half-hearted avoidance, she decided to finally clean it out. If she could find enough intact bales, perhaps she could insulate the tack room a bit better, or at least clear space to store her dwindling supplies. Dusty watched her as she approached the barn, his mane ruffled by the breeze. Rebecca couldn't help but smile at his curiosity. She hoisted the creaky ladder up to the hayloft, and with a grunt, pulled herself into the dim, dust-choked space. The floor groaned under her weight, and dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light slanting through the roof. She worked methodically, pushing aside rotted bales, stacking the dry ones, and trying not to think about what else might be hiding in the shadows. Halfway through the pile, a sharp thud echoed behind her. She turned to see Dusty at the base of the ladder, pawing at the barn floor and tossing his head as if urging her on. It was odd, but Rebecca was learning to trust the Mustang's instincts. He seemed more attuned to the place than she could ever be. She resumed clearing the hay, scraping her hands on old boards and tangled wire. Then, as she shifted a heavy bale near the back wall, the floor beneath her creaked sharply. Dusty's agitation below grew, a rapid series of hoofbeats on the wooden planks. Rebecca knelt, feeling along the warped floorboards. One of them felt loose, the edges barely tacked down. Heart pounding, she pried at it, the old nails squealing in protest. The board lifted free, revealing a small, dust-caked box wedged in the darkness, her breath caught in her throat, hands trembling. Rebecca dragged the box into the light. Its lid was tied shut with faded blue ribbon, her mother's favorite color. She undid the knot, feeling a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Inside, nestled among scraps of old quilt, she found her mother's diary, a battered leather-bound book, the pages swollen with time and secrets. There were letters, too, their envelopes soft and yellowed with age, addressed in her mother's swirling handwriting to names Rebecca only half remembered. Neighbors, old friends, distant cousins. Underneath lay a collection of photographs, their black and white images frozen in laughter and triumph. Her mother as a young woman, astride horses with windswept hair, arms around smiling strangers who seemed, for a moment, like family. At the very bottom, wrapped in a faded scarf, were small trinkets from Rebecca's own childhood: a broken ceramic horse, a pressed flower, a locket she thought lost decades ago. The sight of these things hit her harder than she expected. Here, tucked away in a forgotten corner, was proof that her mother had kept her close all those years, even after the distance had grown too wide to bridge. Rebecca sank down, cross-legged on the dusty boards, and opened the diary. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years earlier. She read in the wavering light, her mother's voice unfolding with every word, stories of heartbreak and hope, of long nights spent fighting off loneliness, of wild Mustangs and the stubborn faith that things would get better. There were pages about Rebecca herself, small, everyday triumphs, her first steps, her favorite song, the way she used to laugh when chasing butterflies in the summer fields. The writing was raw, sometimes messy, but threaded through it all was a fierce love and an aching desire to leave something lasting behind. Rebecca lost track of time, turning pages until her fingers grew numb and the shadows shifted around her. The words gave shape to the emptiness she'd carried for so long, offering comfort in their honesty. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt less alone, woven into a story that had begun long before her own troubles, and would, she hoped, outlast them. When she finally looked up, Dusty was still at the base of the ladder, eyes bright and patient. Rebecca smiled, tucking the diary and trinkets safely under her arm. She climbed down and stroked the Mustang's warm neck, murmuring a quiet thank you. That evening, as dusk deepened across the fields, she arranged the box's contents on the table in the tack room. The diary, letters, photos, and keepsakes formed a makeshift altar to memory and hope, a reminder that even in the loneliest places, there could be connection, purpose, and the courage to start again. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca lingered over her mother's words, repeating them like a prayer. She felt a new resolve take root in her chest, a fragile, stubborn promise that she would honor this legacy, no matter how battered or broken the ranch had become. In the darkness, with Dusty's soft breathing just outside, Rebecca drifted into sleep, no longer lost but gently held by the past, ready to face whatever the next day might bring. Rebecca rose earlier now, the chill of each morning propelling her into movement even before the first glimmer of sunrise breached the horizon. Something had shifted inside her since discovering her mother's diary and the small box of keepsakes, a sense of duty, but also a flicker of determination she thought she'd lost. The words her mother had left behind stayed with her, urging her on as she surveyed the broken-down ranch and the long list of repairs that seemed to multiply with every passing day. Her first target was the tack room, the only shelter she truly had. She decided to transform it from a makeshift nest of hay and borrowed blankets into a space she could call her own. Armed with her mother's old hammer and a handful of bent nails scavenged from half-collapsed fences, Rebecca set to work patching holes and reinforcing the walls with boards pried from the unused chicken coop. Her hands shook in the cold, and more than once the hammer missed its mark, sending a shock of pain up her arm. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that winter was barreling closer with every icy gust of wind. She scavenged for insulation, stuffing gaps with rags, straw, and even pages from water-damaged books she found buried in the house. She moved her few possessions, the box of letters, her mother's diary, the cast-iron skillet, the faded family photo, carefully onto a makeshift shelf she built from old barn planks. Each item became an anchor, a piece of the life she was stubbornly stitching together out of scraps and memory. Despite her determination, nothing went as smoothly as she hoped. Tools seemed to break at the worst moments, handles splintering, heads flying off and disappearing into the weeds. When she finally managed to get a small fire going in the corner, smoke billowed through the gaps in the walls, making her cough and watering her eyes. She dragged the smoldering mess outside, heart pounding at how close she'd come to setting the entire tack room ablaze. Even these failures became lessons: how to stack wood properly, how to angle the boards to block the wind, how to check every inch for rot or nests of angry mice. Dusty, ever the silent observer, often appeared at the doorway as she worked, his head tilted in curiosity. Sometimes, in moments of frustration, when a nail bent for the third time or a board split under pressure, Rebecca found herself talking aloud, mostly to herself, but sometimes to the Mustang, whose steady gaze made her feel less foolish. His presence, a mixture of wild freedom and gentle watchfulness, offered comfort when the isolation threatened to tip into despair. One evening, after a particularly grueling day spent hauling debris from the barn and mending a section of fence that collapsed under its own weight, Rebecca sat on the edge of her makeshift cot, utterly spent. Her hands were blistered and raw, and her back throbbed from lifting heavy boards and wrestling with frozen wire. She let herself cry, quietly, the tears hot against her chilled cheeks. The sense of failure was overwhelming, a voice whispering that she was foolish to think she could save this place, that she was clinging to ruins, both literal and figurative. But in the stillness, a memory from her mother's diary surfaced, a passage about stubbornness, about pushing through when the land seemed bent on breaking you. Rebecca dried her face with the sleeve of her coat and stood again, gathering the scattered tools and stacking them neatly for the morning. She forced herself to look around the room, to acknowledge every patch of fixed wall, every cleared corner, every board that held strong despite the odds. Small victories, she reminded herself, were still victories. Her meals remained simple: old preserves on stale bread, boiled potatoes with salt, the occasional treat of wild berries found along the fence line. Yet even these moments of nourishment felt earned. Sometimes, as she ate, Dusty would appear at the window, his breath fogging the glass. She'd offer him a carrot or a handful of oats, and he'd accept with a cautious nuzzle, their growing trust a balm against her isolation. The days blended together, marked by exhaustion and fleeting pride. Each setback, tools broken, cold seeping through the walls, exhaustion that made her hands clumsy, was balanced by progress. A roof patched against the rain, a wall that no longer rattled in the wind, a night when she finally slept through the darkness without waking in fear. Rebecca's inexperience made every project a challenge, but she clung to each lesson, refusing to be defeated by her own mistakes. The ranch was not just a burden or a reminder of loss. It was a place where she could rebuild, not just the battered buildings, but herself as well. Through it all, Dusty remained her steady companion, his playful antics sometimes drawing a reluctant smile, his patience reminding her that transformation, of a horse, a ranch, or a life, was never quick or easy. Each day's efforts, no matter how imperfect, stitched her a little more firmly to the land, to her mother's memory, and to the hope that, despite everything, she might yet find belonging here. By the time frost etched white patterns across the ranch's ragged grass, Rebecca had lost count of the days since she'd left behind city life and the world she once knew. The tack room, though crude, now had walls that didn't shudder with every wind and a small fire that kept the worst of the cold at bay. Each sunrise brought new tasks, fixing leaks, patching fence rails, foraging for food. The physical labor left her exhausted, but it was a fatigue she welcomed. There was a certain dignity in tired muscles and cracked hands, in earning sleep each night. The loneliness, though, never fully left her. In the city, she had found ways to mask it. Long walks, books, the noise of crowds, the reassuring clatter of her children's visits, rare as they were. Out here, the ranch was an ocean of silence, broken only by Dusty's soft hoofbeats and the distant caw of crows. Sometimes at dusk, Rebecca would stand by the old gate and let the wind push her hair back from her face, her eyes drifting down the empty road, wishing for the sight of someone she loved. The wish was answered one afternoon in the most unexpected way. She was inside the barn, untangling a knotted length of rope, when she heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel. Her heart stuttered, hope and fear colliding in her chest. She wiped her hands on her jeans and hurried outside, blinking against the glare of the afternoon sun. Two figures stepped out of the parked car. Her son, Henry, tall and serious, and Sarah, her daughter, bundled against the chill in a scarf and coat. For a moment, Rebecca felt herself drawn back in time, to days when her children were small, when their laughter filled kitchens and car rides, when she was the anchor of their world. But the years had carved distance between them, and their faces now carried an edge of worry that she couldn't ignore. Henry spoke first, his voice tight with concern as he looked around at the rundown house, the collapsed barn, the overgrown yard. Sarah's eyes darted anxiously from the paddock to the tack room, taking in every detail with growing disbelief. Rebecca braced herself, knowing what was coming. She tried to explain about the ranch, the inheritance, her plans to fix things up, the small steps she'd taken. But her words felt inadequate in the face of their alarm. Their worry quickly turned to frustration. They questioned her judgment, her safety, even her sanity. Henry's voice rose as he pointed out the risks. The cold, the isolation, her lack of experience with ranch life. Sarah, near tears, pleaded with her to come back to the city, to seek help, to let go of what they saw as an impossible dream. The sharpness of their concern cut deeper than any winter wind. Rebecca tried to answer, to share what the ranch and her mother's legacy meant to her, but the words stuck, heavy and awkward. The conversation frayed, old hurts and misunderstandings resurfacing, and the three of them stood at the center of the ruined yard, voices echoing off splintered wood and empty fields. In the end, Henry and Sarah made their position clear. They thought she'd lost touch with reality. They urged her to leave, or at least to let them make arrangements for her safety. Rebecca's heart clenched, a familiar ache rising as she watched her children gather their things, their faces closed and distant. She longed to bridge the gap, to make them see the hope she felt for the first time in years. But the distance between them seemed insurmountable, a chasm filled with old disappointments and fears neither side could name. When the car pulled away, the dust rose behind it, swirling in the golden light. Rebecca stood alone, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath trembling in the cold. The silence felt heavier now, pressing in on her from all sides. She walked the perimeter of the ranch, each step dragging with the weight of doubt. The tack room, once a sanctuary, now felt empty and vulnerable. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the words of her children replaying in her mind, harsh and loving, worried and raw. For days she moved through her chores in a haze, her resolve shaken. Every small failure, a dropped board, a burned meal, a leak that let in rain, felt like confirmation of her children's fears. The loneliness grew teeth, gnawing at her confidence, whispering that she was foolish to think she could make this place her own. And yet, Dusty remained, as steadfast as ever. The Mustang lingered by her side, nudging her hand with his soft nose, following her as she worked. When her tears came, quiet, unbidden, he stood nearby, offering silent comfort. In his presence, Rebecca found a fragile strength, a reminder that hope could take root even in broken ground. As autumn deepened and the days shortened, Rebecca faced a painful truth. She couldn't force her children to understand. But she could continue, one step at a time, building a life from the pieces she had left. The ranch, battered and forgotten, was still standing, and so was she. In the face of doubt and heartbreak, she chose to stay. For her mother's memory, for herself, and for the chance that in time her children might one day return, not out of worry, but out of love. The nights grew longer as autumn slid quietly into winter, the old ranch folding itself into silence beneath leaden skies. Rebecca moved through each day with a quiet tenacity, but the confrontation with her children haunted her. Their words, sharp with worry and disbelief, left wounds she nursed in solitude. Yet as the wind whistled through the gaps in the tack room and the wood stove guttered low, she held tight to the small flame of determination that remained. On a day when gray clouds hung low and the air tasted of impending snow, Rebecca heard the creak of old hinges at the front gate. At first she thought her mind was playing tricks, hoping perhaps for her children to return. But when she looked up from splitting kindling, she saw not Henry or Sarah, but an older woman striding up the path. She moved with purpose, her figure wrapped in a heavy wool coat, a battered casserole dish tucked under one arm and a basket hanging from the other. Rebecca recognized Clara almost immediately. Her mother's old rival, the neighbor from down the road, had been a fixture of her childhood summers, sometimes an ally, often a competitor, but always present. Clara's hair was gray now, her back a little more bent, but her eyes still gleamed with sharp intelligence and something kinder, softer than Rebecca remembered. Clara wasted no time. She handed over the casserole with a gruff, "Eat this while it's hot," and, without waiting for an invitation, ducked inside the tack room, her gaze sweeping over the cramped, patched space. She commented on the repairs with a nod, then produced jars of preserves, bundles of kindling, and a loaf of fresh bread from her basket. For a moment, Rebecca was too stunned to do anything but watch as Clara set about tidying, her movements efficient and practiced. Conversation was brief at first, the silences filled by the scrape of boots on the floor and the bubbling of stew on the stove. But as the meal warmed her from the inside, Rebecca found herself opening up in small ways, telling Clara about the repairs, her struggles with the cold, the loneliness, and the stubborn will that kept her from quitting. Clara listened, her responses blunt but never unkind. She shared stories of her own, how she and Rebecca's mother had once argued over the best way to plant tomatoes, or how they'd raced wild horses on a dare one summer long ago. After lunch, Clara insisted on showing Rebecca how to mend the fences properly. Together they braved the wind and fixed a section of wire that Rebecca had patched clumsily, Clara's hands steady and quick despite the cold. She explained how to brace the posts with rocks, how to check for weak spots, and how to drive a nail true. Rebecca watched closely, absorbing each lesson, her confidence growing with each repair. In the following days, Clara's visits became routine. She arrived with jars of jam, root vegetables from her cellar, and practical advice on how to stretch supplies and prepare for the winter. She taught Rebecca how to make preserves from the last wild fruit clinging to the hedgerows, how to can what little she could scrounge from the battered garden, and how to identify the best firewood among the tangle of fallen branches. Under Clara's tutelage, Rebecca learned to bake bread that filled the tack room with warmth and the scent of hope, to fix torn gloves with neat, invisible stitches, and to save every scrap of fabric for future mending. With Clara around, the ranch began to change, not just in appearance, but in spirit. Laughter returned to the air, shy and uncertain at first, then growing bolder as the two women swapped stories by the fire. Clara recounted tales of fierce Mustangs and lost loves, of rivalry that turned to friendship, of seasons when everything seemed lost, and then, suddenly, found again. Rebecca shared her own hopes, her fears, and the fragile dreams she was building with every patched wall and every meal cooked on the battered stove. Dusty, too, grew accustomed to Clara, allowing her to stroke his mane and feed him treats. The Mustang's gentle acceptance became a small, daily reassurance that Rebecca was not as alone as she once felt. One evening, as the first flakes of snow drifted across the ranch, Clara and Rebecca sat together, a pot of tea steaming between them. Clara's presence, equal parts stern and nurturing, felt like a lifeline, a reminder that survival was possible, not just through stubbornness, but through the unexpected kindness of others. Rebecca realized she was changing. She found herself looking forward to Clara's visits, to the comfort of shared work and shared silence, to the warmth of human connection she had nearly forgotten. The lessons extended beyond practical skills. Clara taught her how to accept help, to laugh at her own mistakes, and to let hope in little by little. As winter closed its grip around the old ranch, Rebecca no longer faced it alone. She was stitched into the fabric of the land and the community, her mother's legacy living on in every repaired fence, every loaf of bread, every new friendship. The ranch, battered by time and neglect, began to feel not just like a burden, but like the beginnings of a home. And in Clara's steady company, Rebecca rediscovered something she'd thought forever lost, a sense of belonging and the courage to start again. Winter finally arrived in earnest, blanketing the plains in a relentless silence. The sky grew heavy with low, iron-gray clouds. Every morning, Rebecca woke to a world rimed in white, the old ranch transformed by frost and the hush of snow. The cold was everywhere, creeping through the cracks in the tack room walls, biting through her patched coat, numbing her hands no matter how many layers she wore. Each breath felt sharp, each movement an effort against the weight of winter. Survival became a more desperate business. Rebecca and Clara fell into a steady rhythm, meeting every few days to share supplies and check on one another. Clara's practical wisdom and dry humor remained a source of comfort, but as the storms grew fiercer, even she admitted this was one of the hardest winters in years. The woodpile dwindled faster than Rebecca had planned, and sometimes, in the howling dark, she wondered if her stubbornness had finally crossed into folly. Dusty, more than ever, became her silent companion. The Mustang had grown less skittish, trailing her during chores, nuzzling her pockets for treats, lingering by the fence in the afternoons. Rebecca often caught herself talking to him as she worked, sometimes voicing worries she could share with no one else. In return, Dusty watched her with calm, intelligent eyes, as if offering the kind of faith she couldn't always find within herself. The storm that changed everything arrived in the dead of night, without warning. Icy wind battered the tack room, rattling the loose windows, driving snow under the door and across the floor. Rebecca woke with a start, heart pounding as the gale howled around her. The fire had gone out, and the cold cut deep. For a moment she sat up, shivering, listening for any sign of danger. Then she remembered. She'd left a bucket out in the barn. With feed running low, she couldn't afford to let it freeze. Pulling on her boots and coat, Rebecca braced herself and stepped into the storm. The snow was blinding, swirling in every direction, erasing the familiar shapes of barn and fence. She moved by instinct, one hand outstretched, boots crunching through deep drifts. The barn loomed out of the darkness, its door banging wildly in the wind. She reached the stable and ducked inside, breath ragged with cold and effort. The musty scent of hay and horse filled the air. She found the bucket, but as she turned to leave, her foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath scattered straw. Time slowed, a jolt of terror, then pain as her head struck the edge of a stall. For a moment, the world dissolved into a blur of sound and darkness. Rebecca drifted in and out of awareness, the chill seeping through her clothes, the barn spinning around her. She couldn't move. Panic flickered at the edge of her mind. The cold pressed in, relentless and impersonal. Then, as if from very far away, she heard a frantic pounding, a steady rhythm, loud and insistent. Dusty. The Mustang's hooves echoed through the barn, growing louder. He nudged her shoulder with his soft muzzle, whinnying and stomping, refusing to let her slip away. Rebecca tried to focus, her mind fighting the fog of pain. Dusty's insistent presence was an anchor, his panic urging her not to surrender to the cold. He pushed at her again, hard enough that her head cleared for a moment. Then his hoofbeats changed, no longer near but racing away. Outside, the storm raged, but Dusty galloped through the blizzard, mane streaming behind him. He crashed through a broken section of fence, cutting a wild path across the field toward Clara's distant house. Clara, roused by the pounding and the frantic whinnies outside her window, wasted no time. She pulled on her coat and boots, lighting a lantern and grabbing a heavy blanket. Following Dusty's trail through the snow, she found Rebecca sprawled in the barn, shivering and half-conscious. With practiced hands, Clara wrapped the blanket around Rebecca, checked her head for injury, and managed to half-carry, half-drag her back toward the tack room. Dusty followed every step, his sides heaving, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. Once inside, Clara stoked the fire and brewed strong tea, forcing Rebecca to sip as she drifted in and out of awareness. Hours passed. The storm eased. Warmth slowly returned to Rebecca's limbs, bringing aches and bruises, but also the fierce gratitude of survival. Clara scolded her gently, then set about tending to the barn, making sure Dusty was safe and fed. When Rebecca finally managed to sit up, Dusty stood at the door, snow clinging to his mane, watching over her with a patience deeper than words. In the days that followed, Rebecca moved slowly, but she was alive. The ordeal left her shaken, But it changed something fundamental between woman and horse. Dusty was no longer just a symbol of her mother's past or a wild creature to be tamed. He was her rescuer, her loyal companion, as essential to her survival as food or fire. As the last snows of the season drifted down, Rebecca understood the true depth of Dusty's loyalty. In that frozen crisis, she had learned something precious. Sometimes the strength to carry on comes not from within, but from the bonds we forge. With people, with animals, with the land itself. The ranch, battered by winter but still standing, was no longer just a test of her endurance. It was a place where she belonged, with a Mustang at her side who would never let her fall. The storm passed, leaving behind a landscape remade in white silence. For days, Rebecca moved slowly, the bruises on her body reminders of how fragile survival could be. But she was alive. More than that, she was changed. Inside, something resilient had awakened, born of gratitude and the fierce loyalty she'd witnessed in Dusty and the steadfast kindness of Clara. As the sun returned, glinting off the snowdrifts and coaxing meltwater from the icicles, Rebecca found herself seeing the ranch with new eyes. The battered fences and sagging barn no longer seemed like burdens, but as parts of a story, a legacy she was now determined to honor and continue. Spring was still distant, but each lengthening day was a small promise, a whisper that things could grow again. Her recovery was slow, but the rhythm of chores returned. Clara checked in regularly, often bringing soup, advice, and a steadying presence that had become as essential as any tool in the barn. Together, they dug out snowdrifts from the barn doors and restacked the dwindling woodpile. Rebecca patched her coat with old scraps of fabric, every neat stitch another step toward reclaiming her resourcefulness. She no longer hid her setbacks or tears from Clara. Their friendship, forged in hardship and laced with laughter, had become an anchor in the uncertain current of each day. Dusty's loyalty deepened. He followed Rebecca with unwavering patience, his eyes brighter now, his coat sleek from daily care. She began braiding small sections of his mane, at first as a way to pass the hours, then as a ritual, a simple grounding act. The feel of Dusty's hair between her fingers was oddly reassuring, a tactile reminder that she wasn't alone, that something wild and good had chosen her as his person. Inside the tack room, Rebecca slowly transformed the cluttered space into a true sanctuary. She swept away old straw and dust, whitewashed the battered walls with leftover paint Clara found in her shed, and tacked colorful quilts over the windows to keep out drafts. She salvaged a wooden crate, sanding it smooth and painting it sky blue, turning it into a small table for her meals. Over the cot, she strung a line and hung her mother's old photographs. Snapshots of sunlit fields, wild mustangs running, and summer afternoons spent laughing beside the pond. The images brightened the room, their faded edges framing the continuity of family, hope, and hard-won joy. But the real transformation was the memory wall. After sorting through the letters and diary entries she'd found in the hayloft, Rebecca decided to turn one entire wall into a tapestry of memory and tribute. She arranged the diary, old trinkets, pressed flowers, and mementos with care, pinning each piece so it told a story, the story of her mother's resilience, of wild horses and wild hearts, of family both lost and found. At the center, she placed the locket from her childhood, now holding a small braid from Dusty's mane. It was a wall of belonging, proof that even broken things could be made beautiful again. As her confidence returned, Rebecca found herself wanting to share her journey, not just with Clara, but with her own children. The pain of their last visit lingered, but it no longer defined her. She realized she'd been clinging to pride, afraid to show them her struggle or her loneliness. Now, she understood that reaching out was not weakness, but courage, the kind her mother had written about so often in her diary. One afternoon, while the wind still rattled the eaves and sunlight gleamed off the remaining snow, Rebecca gathered pen and paper. She sat at the blue crate and wrote to Henry and Sarah. The words came slowly at first, then poured out as she described the hardships, the failures, and the unexpected joys she'd found on the ranch. She wrote about Dusty's bravery, about Clara's unwavering support, and about the memories she'd uncovered, both painful and precious. She admitted her doubts, her fears, and the ways she'd learned to let go. She invited them to see what she was building, to walk the land that had shaped their family for generations. Before sealing the letters, Rebecca tucked in small gifts. For Henry, a lucky horseshoe she'd found in the old barn, cleaned and polished until it shone. For Sarah, a braid from Dusty's mane, tied with a ribbon from her grandmother's sewing basket. They were tokens, humble but heartfelt, bridges across the distance that had separated them. Spring crept closer, one melting icicle at a time. The ground softened, and green shoots appeared in the garden's ruined beds. Clara brought seeds, beans, carrots, wildflowers, and together they planted, their hands working side by side, their laughter mingling with the caw of blackbirds overhead. The ranch was not fixed, not whole, but it was alive. Rebecca woke each morning with a sense of purpose and gratitude, her hands eager for the day's work. She spoke to Dusty as she moved through chores, confiding her hopes and worries, and the Mustang listened with the patience of one who understood the long, slow work of healing. With the memory wall complete, Rebecca invited Clara for a small meal, a celebration of what they'd endured, what they'd built together. They shared fresh bread and preserved berries, raising their mugs in a quiet toast to resilience, to old friends, to the future. The glow of lamplight illuminated the photos, the letters, and the wild Mustang's mane, woven now into the tapestry of a home reborn. And as night fell, Rebecca felt ready. She had reached out to her children, opened her life, and filled her home with memory and hope. Whatever came next, she knew she would face it not alone, but surrounded by the legacy of love and perseverance that had brought her this far. Spring arrived gently, almost cautiously, on the wide, wind-swept plains surrounding the ranch. The snow had melted into ribbons of clear water, carving small rivulets through the thawing fields. Green shoots poked bravely from the soil, a promise of life after months of cold and hardship. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, of fresh hay, and of wildflowers struggling to bloom. For Rebecca, it was a new beginning, and a test of her patience and resolve. Weeks had passed since she had sent letters to Henry and Sarah. Each day she checked the mailbox with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She didn't dare imagine their response, wary of the disappointment that had followed their previous visit. Yet the letters had been honest, heartfelt, and most importantly, full of the quiet strength she had reclaimed through her own labor and the companionship of Dusty and Clara. The day they arrived, the sun poured across the ranch in warm, golden sheets. Rebecca had tidied the tack room, arranged the memory wall with care, and swept the front porch until the floorboards gleamed. Dusty, groomed and sleek from days of careful brushing, paced the paddock, nostrils flaring as he caught her children's scent from the approaching car. Rebecca's heart raced with a strange mix of excitement and fear, the weight of past misunderstandings pressing against her chest. Henry and Sarah stepped from the car, blinking in the bright sunlight, faces softened by the warmth of the day. Their expressions betrayed astonishment as they took in the ranch. The repaired fences, the neatly stacked woodpile, the renewed barn, and the small signs of life everywhere. It was no longer a ruin, no longer a place of danger and despair. It had become a home, a testament to persistence and care, and they saw it all at once, in stark contrast to their last visit. Rebecca met them at the gate. She didn't need words to convey what had changed. The memory wall in the tack room, the patched fences, the flower beds beginning to bloom, each detail told them she had endured, adapted, and reclaimed not just a property, but a sense of herself. Dusty whinnied softly, stepping closer to his beloved family. His presence an unspoken testament to the loyalty that had sustained her. The first moments were quiet, hesitant, almost fragile. Henry studied the barn and the paddock, his eyes softening with the realization that his mother had not only survived, but had flourished in isolation. Sarah walked toward the tack room, drawn by the glimpses of color and light, the orderly warmth of a space carefully curated with care and reverence. The trinkets, photographs, and diary entries that Rebecca had arranged spoke volumes. History, memory, and love preserved through meticulous effort. Inside, the reunion unfolded with a slow, gentle rhythm. Words were exchanged carefully, punctuated by silences that were no longer awkward, but filled with shared understanding. Rebecca showed them the memory wall, recounting the stories behind each photograph, letter, and memento. She spoke of Dusty's loyalty, of Clara's guidance, and of the strength she had drawn from her mother's legacy. Her voice, steady and calm, carried a depth of conviction that left her children both humbled and moved. Henry ran his hand along the rail of a newly repaired fence, glancing at the barn and then at his mother. I didn't realize," he began, the sentence faltering under the weight of realization. Sarah's eyes glistened, and she reached out to touch the braid of Dusty's mane that Rebecca had tucked into a keepsake for her. For the first time since their last visit, there were no accusations, no doubts, only recognition of the labor, the courage, and the love that had transformed the ranch and their mother. The afternoon passed in a series of small, meaningful acts. They repaired a stubborn section of fence together, laughed at Dusty's antics as he nudged and chased them, and shared a meal of fresh bread, preserves, and soup prepared with the fruits of Rebecca's winter labor. The warmth of the fire and the sun streaming through the windows mirrored the thawing of old tensions, creating a space where regret, forgiveness, and love could flourish together. As the day faded into evening, the family sat together around the small table in the tack room. The memory wall glowed in the soft lamplight, each photograph and keepsake a reminder of endurance, memory, and connection. Words flowed more easily now, conversations that had once been choked by fear and judgment now guided by understanding and shared history. Plans were quietly made, future visits, summer picnics, and holidays on the ranch. A sense of continuity settled over the space, fragile but undeniable, stitched together from months of labor, loyalty, and quiet courage. Dusty, standing near the doorway, flicked his ears toward each family member, sensing the shift. He had been Rebecca's steadfast companion through isolation and danger, and now he bore witness to the restoration of her family's bonds. His soft neighs punctuated the conversations, a reminder that loyalty, patience, and love could bridge even the widest divides. Later, as the sky deepened to twilight, and stars began to shimmer over the plains, Rebecca stepped outside for a moment alone. The ranch stretched out before her, the fences straight and the barn repaired, fields beginning to green once more. She breathed deeply, feeling the cool, scented air fill her lungs. She thought of Dusty, of Clara, of her children, and of her mother's enduring presence in the small treasures and diary entries that had guided her journey. The ranch, once a symbol of loss and hardship, had become a place of possibility and renewal, a testament to resilience, hope, and love that endured through time and trials. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt completely at home. She was no longer defined by failure, abandonment, or isolation. She had rebuilt a life, a home, and a family connection. And as the night settled over the plains, she knew that whatever storms might come in the future, she had the strength, the companions, and the enduring bonds to face them. The ranch was alive again, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings, where resilience and love rode as fiercely and freely as Dusty across the endless western horizon.